unless they will agree to come in and sit down in your office and let you teach them this. So I told our Vice President of Poor and Public Relations, I said, now, John, we don't get any more of them out unless they're willing to come in and sit down in my office. Let me take 2 or 3 hours with them. Let me teach them how they're put together. Because they may have gotten into the penitentiary the first time out of sheer ignorance and meanness, but if they get into it after I'm done with it, they're going to have to crawl over their intelligence and crawl over the wall. Get that? Going to have to crawl over their intelligence to get over that wall. So I'd bring them in, and I'd sit down and I'd show them like this. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. Is that right? I'm sitting there one day with this man. You should have seen him. He'd been a very, very handsome man, but now he looked hard as granite, tough. He spent 18 of the last 20 years in penitentiaries. Now, I began to teach him this, and only I had drawn it out on a counting ledger type paper about that long, about that wide. And I had this all written out there, and I was explaining it to him. And he told me, out of the 18 of the last 20 years, he said, Mr. Conn, between my last 2 semesters, I think you know what a semester is. He said, I was out here in Rockford 125 nights. I sat on a bar stool 124 nights. And back I went. I said, well, I'm not your father confessor, but as a little theological research, would you mind telling me why in heaven's name would anybody want to throw their life away sitting in those miserable upholstered sewers? That's what we call them in New York City. Nightclubs and taverns are upholstered sewers. I said, I didn't do that before I was a Christian. They're so rotten and filthy and all that miserable talk that I can't comprehend it. Would you mind telling me why you would go sit on a bar stool 124 nights? He said, yes. And he put his finger on this top one over here at the left. Can you read it? What does it say? Guilt. Guilt. He said, that one right there. And then, friends, he began to sob. He began to cry. Here's a hardened criminal that's been in for assault and battery, for mugging, strong arm, everything. You name it, man, he had done it. And there he sat in my office. He's weeping and he's sobbing like a baby. Tears running down his face like a creek. So I just let him sit there, and when he calmed down, I said to him, now you don't have to, friend. You want to tell me about it? He said, yes. He says, that one right there, and he put his finger on guilt. He said, Mr. Conn, 20 years ago in California, I walked away from a wonderful wife and 4 children. I magnanimously gave her $200 to raise my kids. I deserted her. Now, the dear old liberal state of California never arrested him, never did anything, never put him in jail. But do you think he got away with it, friends? No. He said, I sure didn't. See, California doesn't love their people out there because they let them get away with anything. See, they're California, they don't love. And they got such watered-down types of Christianity out there, you can get away with anything, still think you're a Christian. It's just watered down. It's the toughest place in the world to preach is California. And I know I've preached around the world. I've been doing it for 35 years because they got such a watered-down type of Christianity. And to show you, they don't really love the people in California. They let them get away with anything. You're not loving people when you do that. So he said, Mr. Conn, I'd go into taverns to drown that guilt. Okay, I'd spend all my money. I'd say, wait a minute. The next morning, was the guilt gone? He said, no, it was greater, bigger. So he'd be broke. So he'd go out and he'd mug, he'd strong arm, he'd break and enter, he'd do all this to get more money to go to the taverns to drown his guilt. To drown his guilt. Now let me ask you a simple question. Did he get away from walking away from that wonderful woman? Did he get away with it? Well, he wasn't put in jail for it. Did California, the state of California, really love him? No, they didn't. If they'd arrested him, given him 5 years in the pokey, he might have got out of his system. I say he might. But no. They let him get away with that, and here it messed up 20 years of his life, his kid's life, and everything about it. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he reap. When are we going to start telling this to people? Be not deceived, God is not mocked. This is the way man's put together, that when he does things, it affects him. It affects him. He cannot get away from it. Now let me give you an example, another one. The night after Martin Luther King was assassinated, my wife and 2 daughters and I had wonderful in-laws. They lived in Florida at that time. My father-in-law was a godly old Quaker man. I mean a Quaker that had quaked. And that's where they get the word from, quake. They trembled in their services. In the presence of God. If there's any sin, you really quaked. They weren't there to make a racket. They were there to think and to be in the presence of God. Well, he was a godly man. I thank God for my father-in-law many times. So I wasn't feeling very good, and my wife and 2 daughters and a little neighbor girl started to drive to Florida. Martin Luther King assassinated the night before. So I went in, and the radio was playing. Now, it's a very rare thing in our house that a radio is ever playing and blaring very loud, because we're not trying to escape from anything. See, people with radios blaring around the house are trying to escape from themselves. We're not. You got all that blaring sound, brother, you need a trip to the altar. So I'm going in there, and for once I heard the radio. And it was saying that the blacks were burning down Chicago, Indianapolis, Louisville, Atlanta, and those were places where my daughters had to drive. And with my wife right past them. I got down on my knees and prayed for them to have a safe journey. But then I began to pray for my black brothers. I got a lot of precious black brothers, I really have. I began to pray for them. And here's what I was praying. I said, oh, dear God, I would that you'd let me put this chart every 50 miles in the United States. So you couldn't be anywhere without seeing this in the air, about 100 feet high, 100 miles high, with a letter so big, everybody could read it. Because my black brothers now, they're going to be burning down buildings and things, and they're not going to get arrested. They're not going to get put in jail, but I know they're not going to get away with it. They're not going to get away with it. And my, how I pray for my black friends. Well, let me tell you something. Within 24 hours of the time I'm praying, in the city of Chicago, now I live 90 miles from downtown Chicago, within 24 hours of the time I'm praying, there were some black lads. They had race riots in Chicago, and they're coming down the street. In this 4-door car with the windows down, in the back seat is a man, a teenager with a rifle. It's loaded, and he knew it was loaded. Do you think he knew he had the responsibility of keeping this under control? He sure did. He went by a street corner and had about 30 people on it. There are blacks and whites there. They're all huddled together, wanting to get out of this area. Wherever you're in an area where they're having a race riot, the only wise thing to do is get out of there. Get out of there. The blacks and whites, the wise ones will both get out. So they're all standing there kind of protecting one another, waiting for the bus. As this car went by this street corner, this lad in the back seat took that gun and he aimed right in the middle of this crowd and he pulled the trigger. He didn't aim at anyone particular, but he just shot in there promiscuously. He hit a little girl, 10 years of age, shot her right through the head. She dropped dead. You want to know who it was? His own precious little sister. His own precious sister. Now, I want to ask you a question. He never was arrested for that. But I want to ask you another question. Do you think he got away with it? Do you think he got away with it? I should say he did not. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he reap. He got guilt, he got depression, and let me tell you something. Within 10 days, that black lad was a stark, raving, screaming, psychotic maniac in Dunning State Hospital, and he's there to this day. Now, I don't doubt that boy had been to church maybe a lot of times. Who had ever taught him that when you choose an act due to the way God has created man, you also choose the consequences, primary and secondary, that go along with that act. My dear wife, she has a habit of, when she and I are gone, she has our papers, daily papers, saved. When we get back, she'll read them all. Now, I can't quite get excited about reading a week-old newspaper. Well, I'm with her. I'm lecturing in Oklahoma City. We get back to Chicago. Saturday, I'm sitting there reading a paper, and I'm reading about my dear black brother, Charles Joseph. Charles worked for me in the summertime as a writer. He taught fast-track English in our schools. Best English teacher in the city. We're the second largest city in Illinois. Has a lovely black wife. My daughter Nancy went to 5th grade to Linda Joseph.